الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين وصلى الله على محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل Muhammad. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to a new series that will explore and analyze what has historically been known as and is currently appreciated as the theory and practice of Taqlid. That approach where a person defers their intellect or their understanding to someone who is of greater expertise. We'll look at this within a broader intellectual context, and then later on in the series examine in some considerable detail the jurisprudential dimension of this discussion. Often most of us by default will associate Taqlid, this process of imitation, with just jurisprudential fiqhi discussions, but there is a wider discussion to be had, and there is a greater import to this particular line of inquiry for people who are committed to intellectual liberation and spiritual and religious freedom. And this lecture comes on the back of an introductory cursory presentation that was given on the subject of Taqlid, and now aims to look in more detail at some of the more nuanced discussions and provide the discerning listeners an opportunity to hear out what is discussed often in more advanced seminary classes, classes for people who have a considerable background and backdrop in jurisprudential and other legal studies. So often people are not given a chance to hear out some of the discussions had within these circles of learning. So we aim to share that, but in the spirit which is true to our intellect and true to our commitment to move closer to God. We aim to be analytical and critical in our investigations, to be fair-minded, to point out what is proper and fair of these contributions, but at the same time to have the intellectual alacrity and authenticity and integrity to point out where in places questions still remain, evidences haven't quite met the standard that would be desired from them, and therefore scope is left for other discussion. So this is just to set the picture for what this series hopes to achieve with the help and the assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So first and foremost, we need to place this discussion within a broader understanding of what faith represents and what it amounts to. We find that the essence of the Islamic tradition, and in fact most religious and in fact esoteric traditions, is based upon the idea that man was born to be free. Rousseau, for example, says that I was born free, but then when I entered society I was shackled by it. So many thinkers, revolutionaries or otherwise, have always championed the cause of the human being's freedom. And this pursuit of freedom goes back to the fundamental dignity of a human being, that their humanity is not compromised in any way, shape or form, if at all possible. We find within a religious context, however, there is a key point to be made, that in order to be free servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, true ibad of Allah, we need to free ourselves from all other types of enslavement. We should not be, where possible, economic slaves, mental slaves, social slaves, until the end of that menu of types of enslavement that a person may be brought about into. So we find that if a person is a prisoner of their desires, if a person is under the thumb of their own anger, if a person is caught up in their own ego, whether they are wrapped up in their own forms of imagination, they are not free to worship Allah the way that He is meant to be free. We need to appreciate that in order to be a true servant of Allah, one needs to strive for freedom. This is something which is fundamental and cannot be compromised by anything. This, in terms of the hierarchy of priorities of a believer is the ultimate one, because the one who is not free was not a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what all the prophets came, all the sages have strove in order to achieve, to break the idols, to free people from economic structures that have held them back. And all of that vice and abomination is what the people of Allah have been trying to achieve. Whether we look at the wise philosophers such as Plato and his cave and that thought experiment, or any person who's been committed to freedom has always spoken about these issues. And if we look in a very simple sense, an individual who reads a dua from a book, Mafati al-Jinan, or any other book, if they read it and they are clueless as to the meaning, they are unaware of what the whole point of this narration is, how the hadith that extols the virtues of this dua is speaking of a reality contained within this dua, their dua is respected and it may receive some reward or some type of blessing from Allah, but it is very limited in the impact on a person and in fact the reality of that prayer. Whereas the one who understands, appreciates, is conscious and cognizant of what they're saying, they are in a much better position. They need not be a linguist, they need not be a traditionist, they need not be a philosopher. They can in their own way understand what is being said and not just follow the PowerPoint, not just memorize what they've been told to memorize. They can appreciate and engage in their own way, shape and form. Yes, a linguist will have his own appreciation. Yes, the person who is an expert of literature will have his own appreciation. Yes, a philosopher will have his own dissection. Yes, a mystic will have his own states whilst reciting that. But each person, given their place in life, needs to be able to understand and appreciate for themselves so that they are not just imitating in a way that is parrot-like. No one would want to be called a parrot or someone who just copies and pastes. That is something that would go against our fitrah. So we need to be true to our own selves and to liberate ourselves without denigrating, without being disrespectful and being ill-advised in our criticisms of people. We need to avoid these things, but at the same time create this space for discourse and for discussion. So we find that Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam says in a very clear way that La deena liman la aqla lah. There is no religion for the one who does not have an intellect. What does he mean by that? We find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as was told to the seventh Imam, Imam al-Kadhim, that فَعَلَى اللَّهِ حُجَّتَيْن. Allah has two different proofs. One proof, yes, is that external proof, that messenger who comes at a historical point in time may or may not bring a book which is left as a treasure for us to inherit and to live according to. But there is also a Nabiyyun Ba'atin. There is an inward and an internal prophet, which is the intellect that we have. This is the same intellect in Nahj al-Balagha, which are those buried and hidden treasures. Imam Ali speaks about the prophet coming to extract from man. All men of wisdom have spoken about these themes, but especially the family of the household of the Holy Prophet have given great exposition to some of these delicate discussions. So we find that Allah has given us an internal prophet, which is a proof against us. We can't say to Allah that I was in Amazon completely unaware, because we had an internal guide that followed us wherever we went. Then when accompanied by an external message and an external prophet, we are then in a position of alignment to benefit from that. But there is that internal prophet which remains with us. And it is key to realize that the journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in its truest and in its fullest sense is done through the aql, the intellect, the qalb, our heart, and our a'mal and our actions. So therefore a person has a spiritual imperative to be one who understands, one who appreciates, one who can dissect and can discern. And the condition here and the qualification is that it is done in their own way, in the way that befits their education, their understanding, their capabilities. They must do so. And what we're trying to get at through this series is that religion is something very precious, something very valuable. if you are given a jewel, would you give custody to another person of that jewel without inquiring and looking into who that person is? Are they trustworthy? Are they going to look after this jewel so I get it back unblemished? Or will we arbitrarily just give it to any custodian because they have a very cheap rate they charge for custody of that? No, anyone with wealth will go to Switzerland and will have a very advanced banking system where they will keep their wealth. They will not arbitrarily just leave it if it is of value. Yes, if it's a $10 here, £20 here or there, maybe there's no big deal keeping it under our bed. But if this is something very valuable, we will keep it, if possible, in a place which is befitting. So we find that a person on this basis should not live a life where they take everything to be musallamat. They take everything to be the way it has been put to us. If we're told religion is like this, we accept it without engaging our better faculties and our form of discernment. No, a person needs to explore, to understand, in order to give value and taqeem to this gift Allah has given us. And this is what the Quran explicitly talks about. It talks about those, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ. Allah talks about there is that category of people who listen to that which is said and they follow that which is best. So there is an active process of receiving information, a process of assimilation and organization of that information, and then making a decision as to what to follow. This is a clear process and a guidance that Allah is talking about. Why is this important? This is important because if we do not think for ourselves, a lot of goodness will be blocked from us. If we have a system where if some tribal elder or some leader comes and tells us, do not listen to this person, if we take their word as gospel and take it as the final word on a topic, we may miss out. If we're told, do not read the works of this philosopher, and we didn't, then when we became older and more mature, we read for ourselves, we may think that, wow, I've lost out many years where I could have learnt about the great treasures in what was contained in these works. We need to understand and evaluate for ourselves, otherwise we may miss out on great treasures that were left in the intellectual heritage of humanity, but which we cast aside because we were told to do so. We find so many people in the Quran, they disregarded what the messengers came to bring because they did not engage for themselves their intellects. They listened to what their forefathers had to say and they did not follow this process through. Now, we are often told that these verses where there is a admonishment and criticism of following forefathers in a blind, imitative fashion is purely to do with our usul al-din and our belief system to do with God or prophethood and the belief in the Day of Judgment and the ancillary beliefs which stem from these three principal prongs of belief. But we find that although the context of these verses, yes, suggests so, the Quran has not stated explicitly that you should only think for yourself to do with usul al-din. The Quran does not say so. And we find that if that was the case, the Quran would be leading us into trouble. Because if we in one area think for ourselves, in other areas do not think for ourselves, we run the risk and we create the danger that we will deactivate our uqul and our intellects. We will become people who have shut down that intellectual system. We have killed that prophet off, or we cannot think for ourselves. What I would like to just end with is to say that we may contend that if we leave the usul dimensions of faith, those belief systems, and we go to the law, that I only need to engage an expert. That is what the aql says, I must engage an expert. If I give you an example from the legal world, you may find a financier or a CEO of a company, yes, will instruct a law firm and says, I want you to investigate this legal matter because this is your field of expertise. But will they stop at doing that? Or will they inquire from them and define certain types of inquiry if they have that expertise and that knowledge that we want you to answer these questions? Or will they at least, once they get that information, process it and say, okay, are there any other options available? What is the highest risk strategy? What is the lowest risk strategy? Is the law ready to change? In this vein, they will begin to inquire, is your bill how it should be, what rates have you used, they will engage with that expert. This is an example just to illustrate that when we engage an expert and we instruct one, we don't switch off at that point and treat everything they say to be salim, and we take whatever the case is. If we find another legal opinion produced by another law firm that says that the Bribery Act does not have the application you've suggested, would we disregard that opinion, or would we say to our lawyer that I've read from a competitor of yours a different opinion on this matter? They have a client publication that says in fact the Bribery Act will not have as severe ramifications as you've suggested. Of course they will engage with that. They are intelligent people who understand and are concerned about the cogency of their legal advice. They will of course engage in a respectful way, appreciating their expertise. So they will have that diligence. They will instruct an expert with it, but they will not just switch off entirely and just be submissive and passive to the information they receive. This is a spirit which is notable and credible, and is a sign of a sophisticated consumer. Allah wants us to be sophisticated consumers of knowledge and of understanding. In light of that, what I aim to do, inshallah, God willing, is to discuss over the coming lectures with particular focus upon jurisprudential discussions to do with taqlid. Firstly, what is taqlid from a linguistic point of view, from a jurisprudential point of view, but also from a conventional and a customary point of view, with an aim to bring up a reasoned line of inquiry why we should be very cautious and ill-advised just to follow one person for the rest of our lives until we die. They may die, but we will even continue throughout our life to follow that one person. We will only accept from them. We will believe everything they say in any respect and in any field, and we will disagree and we will discredit, and in some places even war against alternative opinions, delegitimize, strip away any authority from any alternative scholarship and any other type of erudition. This type of excessive imitation is not what is wanted from the Quran, is not something that is supported from the riwayat or any other type of jurisprudential inquiry. So we will aim in that vein to criticize this line of inquiry. Not to say that going back to expertise is something which is an act of folly. No, there is great reason to go back to an expert, but that does not mean that we should be extreme in our following of one person and one person alone. So we will aim to look at the Quran, the Sunnah, what the collective scholarship of scholars have said, and what the Aql has to say about these matters. Put forward the arguments, but then also evaluate them. Then ultimately put forward an alternative system of inquiry based upon inquiry and a su'al, to appreciate, to investigate, to follow the proof if we are in a position to follow the proof. A system where we recognize expertise and respect the hard work of scholars, but we're also true to the historical progression of thought within the Muslim community, and follow a system which is not overly difficult, which is based upon a deen which is sahlun yasir, which is meant to be simple and straightforward, will not turn us into thoughtless people who are robotic in their follow of faith and who are not fanatical in their adherence to the religion of Allah, and follow a system of inquiry which will not turn us into splinter groups, into factions, into warring communities who are exclusivists. If you follow my scholar or someone like my scholar, I'm in good terms. If you don't, I'm going to war against you and wage a intellectual and it's sometimes physical battle against you. We want to move away from that in a way that we can be truly free. People who can have hearts filled with love, and people who are true to the way of the Rasul al-Akram sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. People who can appreciate what Rousseau has said, what Plato has said, what other great thinkers have put forward, so that we can live a life where we can move towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our intellects, through our hearts, and through righteous deeds. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His assistance and support in achieving this, inshaAllah. We end by saying وَآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا أَنَ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ, that our final call is all praise is due to Allah. وَالصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَآلِ بَيْتِهِ الطَّاهِرِينَ.